From London, this is the Standard Podcast, and I'm Mark Blunden. Coming up on today's show, surrealism for the home with East End artists Philip and Charlotte Colbert. But first, the Evening Standard reveals on Tuesday that more than 30 extra low-traffic neighbourhoods could be built across London with funding from Mayor Sadiq Khan's transport body. About 120 LTNs, which have proved divisive, were introduced across the capital at the start of the pandemic in a bid to make walking and cycling safer and more attractive, as Londoners were urged to avoid public transport. Our transport editor Ross Lydall reports the LTN funding data was revealed in Transport for London's annual progress report, and Ross joins us now. What are you reporting on Tuesday?
Well, in short, there will be around 30 to 40 more low-traffic neighbourhoods potentially coming to the streets of London. Many readers and listeners will be familiar with LTNs. These are the sort of residential areas through which vehicles or motorists who don't live in the area can't drive through, this sort of so-called rat running. So these were set up in some places many, many years ago. You know, there's one in Islington in de Beauvoir Square that's been there for about 40 or 50 years, and it's a rather lovely cut through if you're on a bike. But in essence, these LTNs really started to spread around the time of the start of the pandemic back in 2020. And the idea was to make it safer and more pleasant to walk and cycle. This, of course, was a time when we were discouraged from getting on public transport to avoid spreading the virus and to allow the buses and the tubes to be kept free for key workers. Now, LTNs proved rather divisive, shall we say, but the latest discovery here is that Transport for London has set aside funding for the borough councils that actually do the hard work and actually install the LTNs. So should the boroughs want to come to TfL and ask for money, the money is there. We've got probably around £50 million a year, both for the last year and for the current year. So TfL estimates that more than 30 new LTNs could be in place. We have currently around 100 just now, so you're looking about an increase of sort of 30 to 40%.
What are TfL saying about the new LTN locations?
Yes, well, you would hope that actually if TfL is about to dish out the cash, then it knows exactly who's been applying for it. Sadly, my inquiries to TfL have rather fallen on, not so much deaf ears, but have fallen during the holiday season when I was told yesterday that it was proving rather tricky to get a full list of these 30 or 40 LTNs because people were not at their desks. They were probably somewhere up a mountain or on a beach. So what I can tell you, for example, is some of the more recent ones that have been sort of under the proposals include in West Dulwich, down in Lambeth. There was also a recent controversy where Lambeth Council decided to axe a different LTN in the sort of Streatham area because of the knock-on issues that seem to be causing to buses. So you can see from that LTNs don't always work and do cause knock-on impact. In essence, what they do is they either use CCTV cameras or giant sort of planters or bollards to discourage or block roads.
Could you remind us how they work and what they look like?
Often, if you live in the area, you can still drive through and your registration will be known to the CCTV camera and you won't be sent a fine. But if you live outside the area and you try and use a local or residential road as a cut through, you can expect to be caught on camera and have probably a fine of around £180 drop on your doormat in the next sort of week or two. So a rather big financial shock is on the cards if you disobey the rules. The issue with some of these, though, to be fair to drivers, is they're quite hard to spot. Quite often you're sort of halfway through before you realise you've just passed the spy camera. There have been issues with signage. I've seen this for myself up in Bowes area in Bounds Green, where it was far from obvious when I was up looking at the zone a few years ago, and a couple of elderly drivers got caught, and you have to feel some sympathy for them. They simply didn't realise quite what they were meant to do or how best to avoid it. By and large, what they do is prevent traffic from going through residential areas, so make the streets safer around homes and around schools, and essentially require drivers who are passing through an area to use the main roads rather than the side streets.
What are the arguments for and against LTNs? Particularly cabbies we interviewed for our mayoral election series were particularly critical of access problems.
According to research published last year by TfL in relation to the new LTNs introduced since 2020, they found that these had helped to reduce the number of road casualties in the area by about 50%, and there had been 74% less traffic. So the most obvious impacts are there will be fewer vehicles, and as a direct result of that, there should be fewer road collisions. So pedestrians will be less at risk, cyclists less at risk, and indeed other road users should be less at risk. In terms of issues, the sort of thing you're referring to there, that sounds very familiar in terms of what was happening with the sort of Bishopsgate LTN. It was a slightly different scheme there, but by and large, this prevented black cab drivers and other minicabs and so on from driving up a section of Bishopsgate. And cabbies found this particularly frustrating, especially if they were trying to drop passengers at the train station or collect them at the train station and perhaps take them to the likes of Guy's Hospital or St Thomas's Hospital over the river, or to St Bartholomew's Hospital or the Royal London Hospital slightly nearer. So there are pluses and minuses. There has been polling over many years about the popularity of LTNs. The most recent polling in London revealed that they were seen as more popular than not. However, this isn't terribly up-to-date polling, but there was a poll that was a nationwide poll that came out a month or so ago. This was an Ipsos poll, which essentially said that they were slightly more popular than they weren't. It was sort of around 40% in favour, 38% opposed, but that slightly changed. The people then said, well, hang on a minute, what if this LTN moved from being an in-principle idea to actually reality and you were living within it? Would you like it quite as much? And then actually slightly more people said they didn't like the sound of it. So there's always been a difference of opinion. It seems, though, that once LTNs have had a chance to bed in, then they do become more popular, certainly for people living within them, because you can see and feel the benefits.
Let's go to the ads. Coming up, Spitalfields-based artists Philip and Charlotte Colbert on finding everyday beauty in colourful household items. Why not hit follow on this podcast in the meantime and give us a rating? Welcome back. Now, make sure to grab a copy of Tuesday's Evening Standard because the newspaper centre spread is a feast for the eyes. Our acting culture editor Nick Clark visited the extraordinary Spitalfields home of married artists Philip and Charlotte Colbert. It's packed with bright, colourful pop art and surrealist pieces, but what about their everyday teapots and vases? And we wanted to know more about their inspiration to create some of London's most striking design pieces. Pop artist Philip and filmmaker Charlotte are collaborating on a new homewares and furnitures project at Chelsea's famous Conran shop. And they join the Standard podcast on the line now. For our listeners, how would you describe your artistic style and what are you currently working on with Conran?
We're both artists and I'm also a filmmaker. Philip has an alter ego as a lobster, and so he uses that very widely within his practice as sculptures and different derivatives. So his space in the Conran shop is very sort of red and poppy and surrealist 60s sort of vibe with a lobster telephone, sort of take on the Dali original lobster telephone, but potentially better. And then my side is very blue with the symbol of the eye sort of present everywhere. The eye for me symbolizes better futures, imagination, the power of dreams, and how, you know, if you can reinvent or rethink a teapot, you can potentially rethink and reinvent government. So yes, so there's furniture and there's crockeries, there's books and all sorts.
Your Spitalfields home looks stunning. What are your thoughts on finding joy in everyday domestic objects? And are there any such items in your collection that you use?
Charlotte and I both have this philosophy, I guess, in the poetry of everyday life, you know, like actually for art. I mean, the greatest inspiration for art is everyday living, because that's, you know, that's what connects us all across the world. It's where we really connect with things in everyday life. It's like the beauty of a flower in a garden, or sort of magical moment between friends or something. There's little moments of everyday life which are actually really special. So in a way, the art of the home is actually a very powerful place. It's actually very close to meaning because it's where we spend so much of our time. Plus, it's an opportunity as an artist to, in a way, play on something that's traditionally regarded as not necessarily art, like something functional, like a vase, or, you know, a teapot is something that basically is an everyday item that people just think is a more functional design, but actually it's a great canvas to playfully reinvent. And so I guess for us, the Conran shop was just a way of extending this interest in like sort of functional artwork into the home and pushing that living art concept. And for us, like, with our own space. I mean, we've definitely always been drawn to artists that have done that in the past. Like one of our great inspirations was the late Betty Woodman, the ceramicist, and we have an amazing vase by her in the house, which we find very inspiring, just to remind us also of our time with Betty and like her spirit of, making amazing artworks and living with them also.
How would you describe the importance and influence of colour in your work?
I think of myself as like a hyper pop artist because, in today's world, with so much digital media influx of information and stuff. So I think we've got this hyper influx of imagery. At the same time, I'm also someone that really believes in the power of primary colours, because the primary colours are like these very radiant, empowering elements. Like I often say that in my work, I try and homage the power of a sunflower. That sort of positive radiance of a sunflower is like such a great, powerful idea for me. So I guess like there's a lot of artists in the past I've really respected, like who've used color, like Fernand Léger or Alexander Calder. And it's almost this generosity of bright pop colors having this punk energy. And I like to use that, I guess, to sort of channel a sort of empowering, positive spirit.
I guess it connects really also to symbols, and like in some ways the messaging and the archetypal power of symbols and how they connect to something within us always, and those associations that are carried within it, whether it be the eye, which sort of links back to sort of these archetypal imagery of dreams and all that stuff, and also obviously the lobster, which carries with it a big historical context.
And what about your use of analog versus digital media?
Well, I very much think of my painting practice as like a sort of Pixar studio, because I definitely really embrace technology, and whether that's in 3D modeling or, the metaverse or robotics or the digital media, like I very much embrace that, because I really believe in the idea that every generation wants to push art forward in terms of language and create new ideas for art. So I'm really like obsessed with this multimedia concept. But I still ultimately always work from drawings as a starting point. Like, and often my paintings are a sort of hybrid between the hand drawing and 3D modeling, which ultimately is always then finished by hand. But it's like a hybrid. And I think for Charlotte as well,
I guess the questioning of digitization is also really interesting. And my work tends to start with questions and sort of build around them a sort of narrative. So the last show I did for Frieze was based around that question of how big tech or the visionaries of today have been so influenced by the dystopias of the 60s and 70s, and in some ways how as a creative community very much expanded to every sort of domain. There's potential in reinventing how we live today in some ways, like an aesthetic of earth living that might be more inspiring.
There's much more on these stories in the Evening Standard newspaper and online at standard.co.uk. The Standard podcast is back on Wednesday at 4 p.m.